Dear students, today let us have a look at David Lloyd's book Consciousness and the Novel, wherein we are supposed to go through the first chapter and the first session of the first chapter titled Consciousness and the Two Cultures. I hope you have gone through the whole article available. As this is a new piece, there are no study resources available beyond the original text. So let us read the original text and try to understand the concepts given in it. Before we go on with this lecture, let me explain to you the significance of the title of this essay or the part of the first chapter, Consciousness and the Two Cultures. What are the two cultures imagined by David Lloyd, a modern critic? And what is the importance of consciousness? These two cultures are actually references to the scientific culture as well as the culture promoted by humanities. So these are the two cultures in discussion here. And what about consciousness? So this consciousness is said to be the essence of the whole dualistic body-mind concept, which we have been thinking about from times immemorial. So how this notion of consciousness has come into the whole discussion of modern novels is actually the subject matter of the whole study, and how this has been imagined by these two cultures, both the scientific culture as well as the culture developed by the humanities. So, when we try to understand the author, he was born in 1935. David Lloyd was a British author, not only an author but also a literary critic. We have many works to refer to this writer, David Lloyd. He is a novelist, he is a critic, and he has contributed many works, especially in history of English language. We find one of his novels titled Things gets discussed in the whole article Consciousness and Two Cultures. There are many works written by the writer David Lloyd. He is a modern writer. Here we have reference to one of his very famous novels titled Things. It was published in 2001, and this has also been translated into many languages. The work that we study, the titled article Consciousness and Two Cultures, consists in the whole critical work Consciousness and the Novel, written by David Dodge. In this book, we have reference to the discussion of the old idea, the Platonistic idea, how this dualism of body and soul exists in literary discussions. Recent studies reject the humanist or enlightenment idea itself based on the Judeo Christian religious tradition that man's soul or spirit consciousness has an essence independent of body. The Platonists even believed that soul or consciousness pre-existed human birth, that is, it already existed in God's consciousness before it got into human body. So the whole book, Consciousness and the Novel, written by David Lodge, actually begins the discussion with this age-old thought of the first philosophers, namely the Platonists. Herein, We have a reference to an American philosopher and cognitive scientist, Daniel C. Dennett, whose work Consciousness Explained is very much significant in this context. There are many recent studies on consciousness, and this is one among them. This American philosopher and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained compares human consciousness to a virtual machine or hardware, while Francis Crick's, here we have the writer, whose book The Astonishing Hypothesis. So this book considers the consciousness, in the words of Lewis Carroll Alice. We have the writer Lewis Carroll. So we are familiar with the writer Alice in Wonderland. We have a reference to the statement, "You are nothing but a pack of neurons." So these arguments, both of these arguments, reject the idea that consciousness has an essence independent of body. So modern studies on consciousness reject the whole idea of consciousness having an essence independent of body. So herein we have what we call the astonishing hypothesis. You read it. Your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So this idea makes it clear that consciousness has no essence independent of body, right? So going ahead, we find Canadian writer Anne Michel's work Fugitive Pieces. This writer discusses many characters who, looking at a prematurely born baby, debate as to whether the soul or consciousness has any independent or immortal existence. The narrator in this novel, Jacob Beer, himself a Holocaust victim, compares this premature child to a Mussulman, the slang term used in concentration camps for a prisoner who is emaciated by starvation and fatigue and is no more than a walking skeleton. Both appear to have no soul or consciousness in them. So, once upon a time, the idea of dualism, body and soul, as two entities existed. It was prevalent in Europe before it was dead and buried. This novel, Fugitive Pieces, opens up once again the issue of dualism. Until recently, consciousness was not much studied by natural sciences, but only by psychology, which considered it as a kind of a black box, which is important to know the input and output without having any relevance as to what went on inside. It may be references to behavior, dreams, novels, etc., which came out of it. So, Freudian psychoanalysis, which was always concerned with trying to understand consciousness, was dismissed by most natural scientists as some kind of religion or a substitute for religion. Recently, academic psychology departments have started to admit Freud and Jung into their syllabuses. So we find an important work written by Carl Gustav Jung, Psychology of the Unconscious. So the scientists' interest in consciousness was stirred up by the discovery of quantum physics, which states that an event is ultimately inseparable from its observer, and hence science is no more absolutely objective and impersonal. So artificial intelligence considers consciousness merely as a software or a virtual machine running on the material hardware, machine of brain. It is only a network of countless neurons. So we have different ideals regarding the standpoints taken on consciousness by different modern, ancient, as well as contemporary philosophies. So in the next section, we'll deal with the contemporary philosophers who have serious thoughts on the nature of consciousness. Thank you very much for your kind listen.